Um, right. So, I am currently live. I'm going to be reading my favorite book. And I'm going to be doing this as part of a weekly thing. I think it would be a good idea, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if to go for what am I going to do? What am I going to do for background music? Should I do music or should I do just rain noises? What games are we playing? We're not playing a game today. Today is a non-gamer day. Rin Wasabi. Alright. Hello, Nanashi. But yes. So I wanted to ask you guys, actually. What? No, it doesn't. Oh, for fuck. It does, I suppose. I need to move this as well. I need to move the chat box. There we go. But yes, I would like to ask you, hello, Halus. I would like to ask you guys, what do you think would you prefer? Would you prefer background music, or would you prefer background white noise? Because I would just like to ask, I suppose. Because obviously I've never done soft jazz background black noise, not white noise. Okay, white noise like the last time. Okay, if you have some specific tune that would fit. I actually don't, so okay, white noise it is. White noise it is. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for helping with that. No noise is fine. I prefer to have a little bit of background noise. Just a cappella between words. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you, Shin. Alright, hi, Lucy. Okay, hello. Hello, pig. Alright, so what I'm going to be doing is, just to reiterate, today I'm going to be reading my favorite novel. My favorite novel is a sci-fi novel called The Player of Games by an author named Ian M. Banks. So I'm going to go and start, if that's okay. Hopefully I'm not too far away from my microphone or anything, because I have been noticing that I tend to sit quite close to my mic. So I hope it's okay. Who's this player and why does he play the games? You'll see. You'll see. All will be revealed. All will be revealed. Okay. Chapter 1, Culture Plate. This is the story of a man who went far away for a long time just to play a game. This man is a game player called Gurge. The story begins with a battle that is not a battle and ends with a game that is not a game. Me? I'll tell you about me later. This is how the story begins. Dust drifted with each footstep. He limped across the desert, following the suited figure in front. The gun was quiet in his hands. They must be nearly there. The sound of distant surf boomed through the helmet sound field. They were approaching a tall dune, from which they ought to be able to see the coast. Somehow he had survived. He had not expected to. It was bright and hot and dry outside, but inside the suit he was shielded from the sun and the baking air, cosseted and cool. One edge of the helmet visor was dark, where it had taken a hit, and the right leg flexed awkwardly, also damaged, making him limp. But otherwise he'd been lucky. The last time they'd been attacked had been a kilometre back, and now they were nearly out of range. The flight of missiles cleared the nearest ridge in a glittering arc. He saw them late because of the damaged visor. He thought the missiles had already started firing, but it was only the sunlight reflecting on their sleek bodies. The flight dipped and swung together, like a flock of birds. When they did start firing, it was signaled by strobing red pulses of light. He raised his gun to fire back. The other suited figures in the group had already started firing. Some dived to the dusty desert floor, others dropped to one knee. He was the only one standing. The missiles swerved again, turning all at once and then splitting up to take different directions. Dust puffed around his feet as shots fell close. He tried to aim at one of the small machines, but they moved startlingly quickly, and the gun felt large and awkward in his hands. His suit chimed over the distant noise of firing and the shouts of the other people. Lights winked inside the helmet, detailing the damage. The suit shook, and his right leg went suddenly numb. "Wake up, Gerge," Ye laughed, alongside him. She swiveled on one knee as two of the small missiles swung suddenly at their section of the group, sensing that it was where it was weakest. Gerge saw the machines coming, but the gun sang wildly in his hands and seemed always to be aiming at where the missiles had just been. The two machines darted for the space between him and Ye. One of the missiles flashed once and disintegrated. Ye shouted, exulting. The other missile swung between them. She lashed out with her foot, trying to kick it. Gerges turned awkwardly to fire at it, accidentally scattering fire over Ye's suit as he did so. He heard her cry out and then curse. She staggered, but brought the gun round. Fountains of dust burst around the second missile as it turned to face them again, its red pulses lighting up his suit and filling his visor with darkness. He felt numb from the neck down and crumpled to the ground. It went black and very quiet. "You are dead," a crisp little voice told him. He lay on the unseen desert floor. He could hear distant, muffled noises, sense vibrations from the ground. He heard his own heart beat and the ebb and flow of his breath. He tried to hold his breathing and slow his heart, but he was paralyzed, imprisoned, without control. His nose itched. It was impossible to scratch it. "What am I doing here?" he asked himself. Sensation returned. People were talking, and he was staring through the visor at the flattened desert dust a centimetre in front of his nose. Before he could move, somebody pulled him up by one arm. He unlatched his helmet. Ye Marsteno, also bareheaded, stood looking at him and shaking her head. Her hands were on her hips, her gun swung from one wrist. "You were terrible," she said, though not unkindly. She had the face of a beautiful child, but the slow, deep voice was knowing and roguish, a low-slung voice. The others sat around on the dust and rocks, talking. A few were heading back to the clubhouse. Ye picked up Gerge's gun and presented it to him. He scratched his nose, then shook his head, refusing to take the weapon. "Ye," he told her, "this is for children." She paused, slung her gun over one shoulder and shrugged, and the muzzles of both guns swung in the sunlight, glinting momentarily, and he saw the speeding line of missiles again and was dizzy for a second. "So?" she said. "It wasn't boring. You said you were bored. I thought you might enjoy a shoot." He dusted himself down and turned back towards the clubhouse. Ye walked alongside. Recovery drones drifted past them, collecting the components of the destructed machines. "It's infantile, Ye. Why fritter your time away with this nonsense? They stopped at the top of the dune. Hi, Newt. And hi, Pampa. They stopped at the top of the dune. The low clubhouse lay 100 meters away, between them and the golden sand and the snow-white surf. The sea was bright under the high sun. Don't be so pompous, she told him. Her short brown hair moved in the same wind which blew the tops from the falling waves and sent the resulting spray curling back out to sea. She stooped to where some pieces of a shattered missile lay half buried in the dune, picked them up, blew sand grains off the shining surfaces, and turned the components over in her hands. I enjoy it, she said. I enjoy the sort of games you like, but I enjoy this too. She looked puzzled. This is a game. Don't you get any pleasure from this sort of thing? No, and neither will you after a while. She shrugged easily. Till then. She handed him the parts of the disintegrated machine. He inspected them while a group of young men passed, heading for the firing ranges. Mr. Gerge? One of the young males stopped, looking at Gerge quizzically. A fleeting expression of annoyance passed across the older man's face, to be replaced by the amused tolerance Ye had seen before in such situations. Sure now, Morat, Gerge? The young man said, still not quite sure. Guilty. Gerge smiled gracefully and, Ye saw, straightened his back fractionally, drawing himself up a little. The younger man's face lit up. He executed a quick, formal bow. Gerge and Ye exchanged glances. An honor to meet you, Mr. Gerge, the young man said, smiling widely. My name's Shuro. He laughed. I follow all of your games. I have a complete set of your theoretical works on file. Gerge nodded. How comprehensive of you. Really, I'd be honored if, at any time you're here, you'd play me at, well, anything. Deploy is probably my best game. I play off 3 points, but... Whereas my handicap, regrettably, is lack of time, Gerge said. But certainly, if the chance ever arises, I shall be happy to play you. He gave a hint of a nod to the younger man. A pleasure to have met you. The young man flushed and backed off, smiling. The pleasure's all mine, Mr. Gerge. Goodbye. He smiled awkwardly, then turned and walked off to join his companions. Ye watched him go. You enjoy all that stuff, don't you, Gerge? She grinned. Not at all, he said briskly. It's annoying. Ye continued to watch the young man walking away, looking him up and down as he tramped off through the sand. She sighed. But what about you? Gerge looked with distaste at all the pieces of missile in his hands. Do you enjoy all this destruction? It's hardly destruction, Ye drawled. The missiles are explosively dismantled, not destroyed. I can put one of these things back together in half an hour. So it's false. What isn't? Intellectual achievement, the exercise of skill, human feeling. Ye just grinned. She said, I can see we have a long way to go before we understand each other, Gerge. Then let me help you. Be your protege? Yes. Ye looked away to where the rollers fell against the golden beach and then back again. As the wind blew and the surf pounded, she reached slowly behind her head and brought the suit's helmet over, clicking it into place. He was left staring at the reflection of his own face in her visor. He ran one hand through the black locks of his hair. Ye flicked her visor up. I'll see you, Gerge. Chambliss and I are coming round to your place the day after tomorrow, aren't we? If you want. I want. She winked at him and walked back down the slope of sand. He watched her go. She handed his gun to the She handed his gun to a recovery drone as it passed her, loaded with glittering metallic debris. Gerge stood for a moment, holding the bits of wrecked machine, then he let the fragments drop back to the barren sand. He could smell the earth and the trees around the shallow lake beneath the balcony. It was a cloudy night and very dark, just a hint of glow directly above, where the clouds were hit by the shining plates of the orbital's distant daylight side. Waves lapped in the darkness, loud slappings against the hulls of unseen boats. Lights twinkled around the edges of the lake, where low college buildings were set among the trees. The party was a presence at his back, something unseen, surging like the sound and smell of thunder from the faculty building, music and laughter and the sense of perfumes and food and exotic, unidentifiable fumes. The rush of sharp blue surrounded him, invaded him. The fragrances on the warm night air, spilling from the line of opened doors behind, carried on the tide of noise the people made, became like separate strands of air, fibers unravelling from a rope, each with its own distinct colour and presence. The fibers became like packets of soil, something to be rubbed between his fingers, absorbed, identified. There, that red-black scent of roasted meat, blood-quickening, salivatory, tempting and vaguely disagreeable at the same time, as separate parts of his brain assessed the odour. The animal roots smelled fuel, protein-rich food. The midbrain trunk registered dead, incinerated cells, while the canopy of forebrain ignored both signals because it knew his belly was full and the roast meat cultivated. He could detect the sea, too, a brine smell from 10 or more kilometres away, over the plain and the shallow downs, another threaded connection, like the net and web of rivers and canals that linked the dark lake to the restless, flowing ocean beyond the fragrant grasslands and the scented forests. Sharp blue was a game player's secretion, a product of standard genofixed culture glands sitting in Gerge's lower skull, beneath the ancient, animal-evolved lower reaches of his brain. The panoply of internally manufactured drugs the vast majority of culture individuals were capable of choosing from comprised up to 300 different compounds of varying degrees of popularity and sophistication. Sharp blue was one of the least used because it brought no direct pleasure and required considerable concentration to produce. But it was good for games. What seemed complicated became simple. What appeared insoluble became soluble. What had been unknowable became obvious. A utility drug, an abstraction modifier, not a sensory enhancer or a sexual stimulant or a physiological booster. And he didn't need it. That was what was revealed as soon as the first rush died away and the plateau phase took over. The lad he was about to play, whose previous match of 4 colours he had just watched, had a deceptive style, but an easily mastered one. It looked impressive, but it was mostly show. Fashionable, intricate, but hollow and delicate too. Finally vulnerable. Gerge listened to the sounds of the party and the sounds of the lake waters, and the sounds coming from the other university buildings on the far side of the lake. The memory of the young man's playing style remained clear. Dispense with it, he decided there and then. Let the spell collapse. Something inside him relaxed, like a ghost limb untensed. A mind trick. The spell, the brain's equivalent of some tiny, crude, looping sub-program, collapsed, simply ceased to be said. He stood on the terrace by the lake for a while, then turned and went back into the party. Jesus, I completely messed up his name there. I'm so sorry. I'm just going to take a quick drink of water. Journal Gerge, I thought you'd run off. He turned to face the small drone which had floated up to him as he re-entered the richly furnished hall. People stood talking, or clustered around game boards and tables beneath the great banners of ancient tapestries. There were dozens of drones in the room too, some playing, some watching, some talking to humans, a few in the formal, lattice-like arrangements which meant they were communicating by transceiver. Maureen Skell, the drone which had addressed him, was by far the smallest of the machines present. It could have sat comfortably on a pair of hands. Its aura field held shifting hints of grey and brown within the band of formal blue. It looked like a model of an intricate and old-fashioned spacecraft. Gerge scowled at the machine as it followed him through the crowds of people to the four colours table. I thought perhaps this toddler had scared you, the drone said, as Gerge arrived at the young man's game table and sat down in a tall, heavily ornamented wooden chair hurriedly vacated by his just-beaten predecessor. The drone had spoken loudly enough for the toddler concerned. A tussle-haired man of about 30 or so to hear. The young man's face looked hurt. Gerge sensed the people around him grow a little quieter. Maureen Skell's aura field switched to a mixture of red and brown, humorous pleasure and displeasure together, a contrary signal close to a direct insult. Ignore this machine, Gerge told the young man, acknowledging his nod. It likes to annoy people. He pulled his chair in, adjusted his old, unfashionably loose and wide-sleeved jacket. I'm Journal Gerge. And you? Stemley Forres, the young man said, gulping a little. Pleased to meet you. Now, what colour are you taking? Green. Fine. Gerge sat back. He paused, then waved at the board. Well, after you. The young man named Stemley Forres made his first move. Gerge sat forward to make his, and the drone Maureen Skell settled on his shoulder, humming to itself. Gerge tapped the machine's casing with one finger and it floated off a little way. For the rest of the match it mimicked the snicking sound the point-hinged pyramids made as they were clicked over. Gerge beat the young man easily. He even finessed the finish a little, taking advantage of Forres's confusion to produce a pretty pattern at the end, sweeping one piece round 4 diagonals in a machine gun clatter of rotating pyramids, drawing the outline of a square across the board, in red, like a wound. Several people clapped. Others muttered appreciatively. Gerge thanked the young man and stood up. Cheap trick, Maureen Skell said, for all to hear. The kid was easy meat. You're losing your touch. Its field flashed bright red, and it bounced through the air, over people's heads and away. Gerge shook his head, then strode off. The little droin, oh my god, gonna take another drink. I'm so sorry, I'm a bit nervous. The little drone annoyed and amused him in almost equal parts. It was rude, insulting, and frequently infuriating, but it made such a refreshing change from the awful politeness of most people. No doubt it had swept off to annoy somebody else now. Gerge nodded to a few people as he moved through the crowd. He saw the drone Chambliss Amalk Nay by a long, low table, talking to one of the less insufferable professors. Gerge went over to them, taking a drink from a waiting tray as it floated past. Ah, my friend, Chambliss Amalk Nay said. The elderly drone was 1.5 meters tall and over 0.5 meters wide and deep, its plain casing matte with the accumulated wear of millennia. It turned its sensing band towards him. The The professor and I were just talking about you. Professor Borelal's severe expression translated into an ironic smile. Fresh from another victory, Journal Gurge. Does it show? He said, raising the glass to his lips. I have learned to recognize the signs, the professor said. She was twice Gurge's age, well into her 2nd century, but still tall and handsome and striking. Her skin was pale and her hair was white, as it had always been, and cropped. Another of my students humiliated? Gurge shrugged. He drained the glass, looked round for a tray to put it on. Allow me, Chamlis Amalkane murmured, gently taking the glass from his hand and placing it on a passing tray a good 3 meters away. Its yellow-tinged field brought back a full glass of the same rich wine. Gurge accepted it. Borelal wore a dark suit of soft fabric, lightened at throat and knees by delicate silver chains. Her feet were bare, which Gurge thought did not set off the outfit as, say, a pair of heeled boots might have done. But it was the most minor of eccentricities compared to those of some of the university staff. Gurge smiled, looking down at the woman's toes, tan upon the blonde wooden flooring. You're so destructive, Gurge, Borelal told him. Why not help us instead? Become part of the faculty instead of an itinerant guest lecturer. I've told you, Professor, I'm too busy. I have more than enough games to play, papers to write, letters to answer, guest trips to make, and besides, I'd get bored. I bore easily, you know, Gurge said, and looked away. Now, Gurge would make a very bad teacher, Chamlis Amalkane agreed. If a student failed to understand something immediately, no matter how complicated and involved, Gurge would immediately lose all patience and quite probably pour their drink over them, if nothing worse. So I've heard, the professor nodded gravely. That was a year ago, Gurge said, frowning, and ye deserved it. He scowled at the old drone. Well, the professor said, looking momentarily at Chamlis. Perhaps we have found a match for you, Chernau Gurge. There's a young... Then there was a crash in the distance, and the background noise in the hall increased. They each turned at the sound of people shouting. Not another commotion, the professor said tiredly. Already that evening, one of the younger lecturers had lost control of a pet bird which had gone screeching and swooping through the hall, tangling in the hair of several people before the drone Morinskell intercepted the animal in midair and knocked it unconscious, much to the chagrin of most people at the party. What now? Borelal sighed. Excuse me. She absently left glass and savoury on Chamlis Amalkamane's broad, flat top and moved off, excusing her way through the crowd towards the source of the upheaval. Chamlis's aura flickered a displeased grey-white. It set the glass down noisily on the table and threw the savoury into a distant bin. It's that dreadful machine Morinskell, Chamlis said testily. Gurge looked over the crowd to where all the noise was coming from. Really? He said. What, calling all that rumpus? I really don't know why you find it so appealing, the old drone said. It picked up Borelal's glass again and poured the pale gold wine out into an outstretched field, so that the liquid lay cupped in midair, as though in an invisible glass. It amuses me, Gurge replied. He looked at Chamlis. Borelal said something about finding a match for me. Was that what you were talking about earlier? Yes, it was. Some new student they found, a GSV cabin brat, with a gift for Stricken. Gurge raised one eyebrow. Stricken was one of the more complex games in his repertoire. It was also one of his best. There were other human players in the culture who could beat him, though they were all specialists at that game, not general game players as he was. But not one of them could guarantee a win, and they were few and far between, probably only 10 in the whole population. So, who is this talented infant? The noise on the far side of the room had lessened. It's a young woman, Chambliss said, slopping the field-held liquid about and letting it dribble through thin strands of hollow, invisible force. Just arrived here, came off the cargo cult, still settling in. The General Systems vehicle cargo cult had stopped off at Cherk Orbital 10 days earlier and left only 2 days ago. Gerge had played a few multiple exhibition matches on the craft and been secretly delighted that they had been clean sweeps. He hadn't been beaten in any of the various games. But he hadn't played Stricken at all. A few of his opponents had mentioned something about a supposedly brilliant, though shy, young game player on the vehicle, but he or she hadn't turned up as far as Gerge knew, and he'd assumed the reports of this prodigy's powers were much exaggerated. Ship people tended to have a quaint pride in their craft. They liked to feel that even though they had been beaten by the great game player, their vessel still had the measure of him, somewhere. Of course the ship itself did, but that didn't count. They meant people, humans, or 1.0 value drones. "You are a mischievous and contrary device," Burelal said to the drone Marin Skell, floating at her shoulder, its aura field orange with well-being, but circled with little purple motes of unconvincing contrition. "Oh," Marin Skell said brightly. "Do you really think so?" "Talk to this appalling machine now, Gerge," the professor said, frowning momentarily at the top of Chambliss Amalcanay's casing, then picking up a fresh glass. Chambliss poured the liquid it had been playing with into Borelal's original glass and replaced it on the table. "What have you been doing now?" Gerge asked Marin Skell as it floated near his face. "Anatomy lesson," it said, its feels collapsing to a mixture of formal blue and brown ill-humour. "A churlip was found on the terrace," Borelal explained, he looking accusingly at the little drone. "It was wounded. Somebody brought it in, and Marin Skell offered to treat it." "I wasn't busy," Marin Skell interjected reasonably. "It killed and dissected it in front of all the people," the professor sighed. "They were most upset." It would have died from the shock in a way," Marin Skell said. "They're fascinating creatures, churlips. Those cute little fur folds conceal partially cantilevered bones, and the loop digestive system is quite fascinating." "But not when people are eating," Borelal said, just selecting another savoury from the tray. "It was still moving," she added glumly. She ate the savoury. "Residual synaptic capacitance," explained Marin Skell. "Or bad taste, as we call it," Chamlin Amalcanay said. "An expert in that, are you, Amalcanay?" Marin Skell inquired. "I bow to your superior talents in that field," Chamlin snapped back. Gerge smiled. Chambliss Amalcanay was an old and ancient friend. The drone had been constructed over 4,000 years ago. It claimed it had forgotten the exact date, and nobody had ever been impolite enough to search out the truth. Gerge had known the drone all his life. It had been a friend of the family for centuries. Marin Skell was a more recent acquaintance. The irascible, ill-mannered little machine had arrived on Cherk Orbital only a couple of 100 days earlier, another untypical character attracted there by the world's exaggerated reputation for eccentricity. Marin Skell had been designated... I messed up. Marin Skell had been designed as a special circumstances drone for the Culture's Contact section, effectively a military machine with a variety of sophisticated, hardened sensory and weapons systems, which would have been quite unnecessary and useless on the majority of drones. Hello, Spider! As with all sentient culture constructs, its precise character had not been fully mapped out before its construction, but allowed to develop as the drone's mind was put together. The culture regarded this unpredictable factor in its production of conscious machines as the price to be paid for individuality, but the result was that not every drone so brought into being was entirely suitable for the tasks it had initially been designed for. Morin Skell was one such rogue drone. Its personality, it had been decided, wasn't right for contact, not even for special circumstances. It was unstable, belligerent, and insensitive, and those were only the grounds it had chosen to tell people it had failed on. It had been given the choice of radical personality alteration, in which it would have little or no say in its own eventual character, or a life outside contact, with its personality intact, but its weapons and its more complex communications and sensory systems removed to bring it down to something nearer the level of a standard drone. It had bitterly chosen the latter, and it had made its way to Chark Orbital, where it had hoped it might fit in. Meat Brain, Morin Skell told Chambliss Amalkane, and zoomed off towards the line of open windows. The older drone's aura field flashed white with anger, and a bright, rippling spot of rainbow light revealed it was using its tight beam transceiver to communicate with the departing machine. Morin Skell stopped in midair, turned. Gerge held his breath, wondering what Chambliss could have said, and what the smaller drone might say in reply, knowing that it wouldn't bother to keep its remarks secrets as Chambliss had. "What I resent," it said slowly, from a couple of meters away, "is not what I have lost, but what I have gained in coming, even remotely, to resemble fatigued, path-polished geriatrics like you, who haven't even got the human decency to die when they're obsolete. You're a waste of matter, Amalkane." Morin Skell became a mirrored sphere, and in that ostentatiously uncommunicable mode swept out of the hall into the darkness. "Cretinous whelp," Chambliss said, "feels frosty blue." Borelal shrugged. "I feel sorry for it." "I don't," Gerge said. "I think it has a wonderful time." He turned to the professor. "When do I get to meet your young, stricken genius? Not hiding her away to train her, are you?" "No, we're just giving her time to adjust." Borelal picked at her teeth with the pointed end of the savoury stick. "From what I can gather, the girl had rather a sheltered upbringing. Sounds like she hardly left the GCV, or GSV. She must feel odd being here. Also, she isn't here to do game theory, Jernau Gerge. I'd better point that out. She's going to study philosophy." Gerge looked suitably surprised. "A sheltered upbringing?" Chambliss Amalkane said. "On a GSV?" Its gunmetal aura indicated puzzlement. "She's shy." "She'd have to be." "I must meet her," said Gerge. "You will," Borelal said. "Soon, maybe. She said she might come with me to Tron's for the next concert. Halfless runs a game there, doesn't he?" "Usually," Gerge agreed. "Maybe she'll play you there, but don't be surprised if you just intimidate her." "I shall be the epitome of gentle good grace," Gerge assured her. Borelal nodded thoughtfully. She gazed out over the party and looked distracted for a second as a large cheer sounded from the centre of the hall. "Excuse me," she said. "I think I detect a nascent commotion." She moved away. Chambliss Amalkane shifted aside to avoid being used as a table again. The professor took her glass with her. "Did you meet Ye this morning?" Chambliss asked Gerge. He nodded. She had me dressed up in a suit, toting a gun and shooting at toy missiles which explosively dismantled themselves. You didn't enjoy it. Not at all. I had high hopes for that girl. But too much of that nonsense and I think her intelligence will explosively dismantle. Well, such diversions aren't for everybody. She was just trying to be helpful. You said you were feeling restless, looking for something new. Well, that wasn't it, Gerge said, and felt suddenly inexplicably saddened. He and Chambliss watched as people began to move past them, heading towards the long line of windows which opened onto the terrace. There was a dull, buzzing sensation inside the man's head. He had entirely forgotten that coming down from sharp blue required a degree of internal monitoring if you were to avoid an uncomfortable hangover. He watched the people pass with a slight feeling of nausea. It must be time for the fireworks, Chambliss said. Yes, let's get some fresh air, shall we? Just what I need, Chambliss said, aura dully red. Gerge put his glass down, and together he and the old drone joined the flow of people spilling from the bright, tapestry-hung hall onto the floodlit terrace facing the dark lake. Rain hit the windows with a noise like the crackling of logs in the fire. The view from the house at Ikro, down the steep wooded slope to the fjord and across to the mountains on the other side, was warped and distorted by the water running down the glass, and sometimes low clouds flowed around the turrets and cupolas of Gerge's home like wet smoke. Ye Maristino took a large wrought iron poker from the hearth, and, putting one booted foot up on the elaborately carved stone of the fire surround, and one pale brown hand on the rope-like edge of the massive mantelpiece, stabbed at one of the spitting logs lying burning in the grate. Sparks flew up the tall chimney to meet the falling rain. Chambliss Amalkane was floating near the window, watching the dull grey clouds. The wooden door set into one corner of the room swung open, and Gerge appeared, bearing a tray with hot drinks. He wore a loose, light robe over dark, baggy trousers. Slippers made small slapping noises on his feet as he crossed the room. He put the tray down, looked at Ye. Thought of a move yet? Ye crossed over to look morosely at the game board, shaking her head. No, she said. I think you've won. Look, Gerge said, adjusting a few of the pieces. His hands moved quickly like a magician's over the board, though Ye followed every move. She nodded. Yes, I see. But she tapped on a hex Gerge had repositioned one of her pieces on, so giving her a potentially winning formation. Only if I'd double secured that blocking piece 2 moves earlier. She sat down on the couch, taking her drink with her. Raising her glass to the quietly smiling man on the opposite couch, she said, Cheers. To the victor. You almost won, Gerge told her. 44 moves. You're getting very good. Relatively, Ye said, drinking. Only relatively. She lay back on the deep couch while Gerge put the pieces back to their starting positions, and Chambliss Amalkane drifted over to float not quite between them. You know, Ye said, looking at the ornate ceiling, I always liked the way this house smells, Gerge. She turned to look at the drone. Don't you, Chambliss? The machine's aura field dripped briefly to one side, a drone shrug. Yes, probably because the wood our host is burning is Bonice. It was developed millennia ago by the old Wavarian civilization specifically for its fragrance when ignited. Yes, well, it's a nice smell, Ye said, getting up and looking back to the windows. She shook her head. It sure as shit rains a lot here, though, Gerge. It's the mountains, the man explained. Ye glanced around, one eyebrow arched. You don't say. Gergely smiled and smoothed one hand over his neatly trimmed beard. How is the landscaping going, Ye? I don't want to talk about it. She shook her head at the continuing downpour. What weather! She tossed her drink back. No wonder you live by yourself, Gergely. Oh, that isn't the rain, Ye, Gergely said. That's me. Nobody can stand to live with me for long. He means, Chambliss said, that he couldn't stand to live for long with anybody. I'd believe either, Ye said, coming back to the couch again. She sat cross-legged on it and played with one of the pieces on the game board. What did you think of the match, Chambliss? You have reached the likely limits of your technical ability, but your flair continues to develop. I doubt you'll ever beat Gergely, though. Hey, Ye said, pretending injured pride. I'm just a junior. I'll improve. She tapped one set of fingernails against the other and made a tutting noise with her mouth. Like I'm told I will at landscaping. You having problems? Chambliss said. Ye looked as though she hadn't heard for a moment, then sighed, lay back on the couch. Yeah, that asshole Elstrid and that prissy fucking Prishable machine. They're so unadventurous. They just won't listen. What won't they listen to? Ideas! Ye shouted at the ceiling. Something different. Something not so fucking conservative for a change. Just because I'm young, they won't pay attention. I thought they were pleased with your work, Chambliss said. Gergely was sitting back on his couch, swirling the drink in his glass round and just watching Ye. Oh, they like me to do all the easy stuff, Ye said, sounding suddenly tired. Stick up a range or two, carve out a couple of lakes. But I'm talking about the overall plan, real radical stuff. All we're doing is building just another next-door plate. Could be one of a million anywhere in the galaxy. What's the point in that? So people can live on it? Chambliss suggested, feels rosy. People can live anywhere, Ye said, levering herself up from the couch to look at the drone with her bright green eyes. There's no shortage of plates. I'm talking about art. What did you have in mind? Gergely asked. How about, Ye said, magnetic fields under the base material and magnetized islands floating over oceans. No ordinary land at all, just great floating lumps of rocks with streams and lakes and vegetations and a few intrepid people. Doesn't that sound more exciting? More exciting than what? Gergely asked. More exciting than this. Mare Steno leapt up and went over to the window. She tapped the ancient pane. Look at that, you might as well be on a planet. Seas and hills and rain. Wouldn't you rather live on a floating island, sailing through the air over the water? What if the islands collide? Chambliss asked. What if they do? Ye turned to look at the man and the machine. It was still getting darker outside, and the room's lights were slowly brightening. She shrugged. Anyway, you could make it so they didn't. But don't you think it's a wonderful idea? Why should one old woman and a machine be able to stop me? Well, Chambliss said, I know the Prishable machine, and if thought your idea was good, it wouldn't just ignore it. It's had a lot of experience and... Yeah, Ye said. Too much experience. That isn't possible, young lady, the drone said. Ye Maristino took a deep breath and seemed about to argue, but just spread her arms wide and rolled her eyes and turned back to the window. We'll see, she said. The afternoon, which had been steadily darkening until then, was suddenly lit up on the far side of the fjord by a bright splash of sunlight filtering through the clouds and the easing rain. The room slowly filled with a watery glow, and the house lights dimmed again. Wind moved the tops of the dripping trees. Ah, Ye said, stretching her back and flexing her arms. Not to worry. She inspected the landscape outside critically. Hell, I'm going for a run, she announced. She headed for the door in the corner of the room, pulling off first one boot, then the other, throwing the waistcoat over a chair and unbuttoning her blouse. You'll see, she wagged a finger at Gurgay and Chambliss. Floating islands, their time has come. Chambliss said nothing. Gurgay looked sceptical. Ye left. Chambliss went to the window. It watched the girl, down to a pair of shorts now, run out along the path leading down from the house, between the lawns and the forest. She waved once, without looking back, and disappeared into the woods. Chambliss flickered its feels in response, even though Ye couldn't see. She's handsome, it said. Gurgay sat back in the couch. She makes me feel old. Oh, don't you start feeling sorry for yourself, Chambliss said, floating back from the window. Gurgay looked at the hearthstones. Everything seems grey at the moment, Chambliss. Sometimes I start to think I'm repeating myself, that even new games are just old ones in disguise, and that nothing's worth playing for anyway. Gurgay, Chambliss said matter-of-factly, and did something it rarely did, actually settling physically into the couch, letting it take its weight. Settle up. Are we talking about games or life? Gurgay put his dark-curled head back and laughed. Games, Chambliss went on, have been your life. If they're starting to pall, I'd understand you might not be so happy with anything else. Maybe I'm just disillusioned with games, Gurgay said, turning a carved game piece over in his hands. I used to think that context didn't matter. A good game was a good game, and there was a purity about manipulating rules that translated perfectly from society to society. But now I wonder. Take this. Deploy. He nodded at the board in front of him. This is foreign. Some backwater planet discovered just a few decades ago. They play this there and they bet on it. They make it important. But what do we have to bet with? What would be the point of my wagering Ecro, say? Ye wouldn't take the bet, certainly, Chambliss said, amused. She thinks it rains too much. But you see, if somebody wanted a house like this, they'd already have had one built. If they wanted anything in the house, Gurgay gestured around the room, they'd have ordered it, they'd have it. With no money, no possessions, a large part of the enjoyment the people who invented this game experienced when they just played it just disappears. You call it enjoyment to lose your house, your titles, your estates, your children, maybe? To be expected to walk out into the balcony with a gun and blow your brains out? That's enjoyment? We're well free of that. You want something you can't have, Gurgay. You enjoy your life in the culture, but it can't provide you with sufficient threats. The true gambler needs the excitement of potential loss or even ruin to feel wholly alive. Gurgay remained silent, lit by the fire and the soft glow from the room's concealed lighting. You called yourself Marat when you completed your name, but perhaps you aren't the perfect game player after all. Perhaps you should have called yourself Shikwai, gambler. You know, Gurgay said slowly, his voice hardly louder than the crackling logs in the fire. I'm actually slightly afraid of playing this young kid. He glanced at the drone. Really? Because I do enjoy winning. Because I do have something nobody can copy. Because something nobody else can have. I'm me. I'm one of the best. He looked quickly, briefly up at the machine again, as if though ashamed. But every now and then, I do worry about losing, I think. What if there's some kid, especially somebody younger and naturally more talented, out there, able to take that away from me? That worries me. The better I do, the worse things get, because the more I have to lose. You are a throwback, Chambliss told him. The game's the thing. That's the conventional wisdom, isn't it? The fun is what matters, not the victory. To glory in the defeat of another, to need that purchased pride, is to show you are incomplete and inadequate to start with. Gerge nodded slowly. So they say, so everybody else believes. But not you? The man seemed to have difficulty finding the right word. I exult when I win. It's better than love, it's better than sex or any glanding. It's the only instant where I feel... He shook his head. His mouth tightened. Real, he said. Me. The rest of the time I feel a bit like that little ex-special circumstances drone Moran Skell. As though I've had some sort of birthright taken away from me. Ah, is that the affinity you feel? Chambliss said coldly, aura to match. I wondered what you saw in that appalling machine. Bitterness, Gerge said, sitting back again. That's what I see in it. It has novelty value, at least. He got up and went to the fire, prodding at the logs with the wrought iron poker and placing another piece of wood on, handling the log awkwardly with heavy tongs. This is not a heroic age, he told the drone, staring at the fire. This individual is obsolete. That's why life is so comfortable for us all. We don't matter, so we're safe. No one person can have any real effect anymore. Contact uses individuals, Chambliss pointed out. It puts people into younger societies who have a dramatic and decisive effect on the fates of entire meta-civilizations. They're usually mercenaries, not culture, but they're human, they're people. They're selected and used like game pieces, and they don't count. Gerge sounded impatient. He left the tall fireplace, returned to the couch. Besides, I'm not one of them. So have yourself stored until a more heroic age does arrive. Gerge said, sitting again. If it ever does. It would seem too much like cheating, anyway. The drone Chambliss Amalkane listened to the rain and the fire. Well, it said slowly, if it's novelty value you want, contact. Never mind SC are the people to go to. I have no intention of applying to join Contact, Gerge said. Being cooped up in a GCU with a bunch of gung-ho I can't speak. I'm sorry. Let me try that sentence again. Being cooped up in a GCU with a bunch of gung-ho do-gooders searching for barbarians to teach is not my idea of either enjoyment or fulfillment. I didn't mean that. I meant that Contact has the best minds, the most information. They might be able to come up with some ideas. Any time I've ever been involved with them, they've got things done. It's a last resort, mind you. Why? Because they're tricky, devious. They're gamblers too, and used to winning. Gerge said, and stroked his dark beard. I wouldn't know how to go about it, he said. Nonsense, Chambliss said. Anyway, I have my own connections there. A door slammed. Holy shit, it's cold out there. Yi burst into the room, shaking herself. Her arms were clenched across her chest, and her thin shorts were stuck to her thighs. Her whole body was quivering. Gerge got up from the couch. Come here to the fire, Chambliss told the girl. Ye stood shivering in front of the window, dripping water. Don't just stand there, Chambliss told Gerge. Fetch a towel. Gerge looked critically at the machine, then left the room. By the time he came back, Chambliss had persuaded Ye to kneel in front of the fire. A bowed field over the nape of her neck held her head down to the heat, while another field brushed her hair. Little drops of water fell from her drenched curls to the hearth, hissing on the hot flagstones. Chambliss took the towel from Gerge's hands, and the man watched as the machine moved the towel over the young woman's body. He looked away at one point, shaking his head, and sat down on the couch again. "Your feet are filthy," he told the girl. "Ah, it was a good run, though," Ye laughed from beneath the towel. With much blowing and whistling and brrs, Ye was dried. She kept the towel wrapped around her and sat, legs drawn up, on the couch. "I'm famished," she announced suddenly. "Mind if I make something to—" "Let me," Gerge said. He went through the corner door, reappearing briefly to drape Ye's hide trousers over the same chair she'd left the waistcoat on. "What were you talking about?" Ye asked Chambliss. Gerge's dissatisfaction. "Do any good?" "I don't know," the drone admitted. Ye retrieved her clothes and dressed quickly. She sat in front of the fire for a while, watching it as the day's light faded and the room lights came up. Gerge brought a tray in loaded with sweet meats and drinks. Once Ye and Gerge had eaten, the three of them played a complicated card game of the type Gerge liked best, the one that involved bluff and just a little luck. They were in the middle of the game when friends of Ye's and Gerge's arrived, their aircraft touching down on a house lawn Gerge would rather they hadn't used. They came in bright and noisy and laughing. Chambliss retreated to a corner by the window. Gerge played the good host, keeping his guests supplied with refreshments. He brought a fresh glass to Ye where she stood, listening with a group of others to a couple of people arguing about education. "Are you leaving with this lot, Ye?" Gerge leaned back against a tapestried wall behind, dropping his voice a little so that Ye had to turn away from the discussion to face him. "Maybe," she said slowly. Her face glowed in the light of the fire. "You're going to ask me to stay again, aren't you?" She swirled her drink around in her glass, watching it. "Oh," Gerge said, shaking his head and looking up at the ceiling. "I doubt it. I get bored going through the same old moves and responses." Ye smiled. "You never know," she said. "One day I might change my mind. You shouldn't let it bother you, Gerge. It's almost an honor." "You mean to be such an exception?" "Mm-hmm." She drank. "I don't understand you," he told her. "Because I turn you down?" "Because you don't turn anybody else down." "Not so consistently," Ye nodded, frowning at her drink. "So? Why not?" There, he'd finally said it. Ye pursed her lips. "Because," she said, looking up at him, "it matters to you." "Ah," he nodded, looking down, rubbing his beard. "I should have feigned indifference." He looked straight at her. "Really, Ye? I feel you want to—" How's that? "I feel you want to take me," Ye said, "like a piece, like an area, to be had, to be possessed." Suddenly she looked very puzzled. "There's something very, I don't know, primitive perhaps about you, Gerge. You've never changed sex, have you?" He shook his head. "Or slept with a man?" Another shake. "I thought so," Ye said. "You're strange, Gerge." She drained her glass. "Because I don't find men attractive." "Yes, you're a man," she laughed. "Should I be attracted to myself, then?" Ye studied him for a while, a small smile flickering on her face. Then she laughed and looked down. "Well, not physically, anyway." She grinned at him and handed him her empty glass. Gerge refilled it. She returned back to the others. Gerge left Ye arguing about the place of geology in culture education policy and went to talk to Ren Lian, a young woman he'd been hoping would call in that evening. One of the people had brought a pet, a proto-sentient Stiglian enumerator which padded around the room, counting under its slightly fishy breath. The slim, three-limbed animal, blonde-haired and waist-high, with no discernible head but lots of meaningful bulges, started counting people. There were 23 in the room. I think Ye's a girl, if that's what you mean. Ye is the girl that he was playing a shooting game with at the start of the book. But I'm not sure if you were there for that. I'm sorry. The slim, three-limbed animal, blonde-haired and waist-high, with no discernible head but lots of meaningful bulges, started counting people. There were 23 in the room. Then it began counting articles of furniture, after which it concentrated on legs. It wandered up to Gerge and Ren Lian. Gerge looked down at the animal peering at his feet and making vague, swearing, pawing motions at his slippers. He tapped it with his toe. "Say 6, the enumerator muttered, wandering off. Gerge went on talking to the woman. After a few minutes, standing near her, talking, occasionally moving a little closer, he was whispering into her ear, and once or twice he reached round behind her to run his fingers down her spine through the silky dress she wore. "I said I'd go on with the others," she told him quietly, looking down, biting her lip, and putting her hand behind her, holding his where it rubbed at the small of her back. "Some boring band, some singer performing for everybody," he chided gently, taking his hand away, smiling. "You deserve more individual attention, Ren." She laughed quietly, nudging him. Eventually she left the room and didn't return. Gerge strolled over to where Ye was gesticulating wildly and extolling the virtues of life on floating magnetic islands, then saw Chambliss in the corner, studiously ignoring the three-legged pet, which was staring up at the machine and trying to scratch one of its bulges without falling over. He shooed the beast away and talked to Chambliss for a while. Yeah, we got a little bit cock-blocked there, didn't we? We thought it was going to be like a steamy romance scene, but unfortunately not. Finally, the crowd of people left, clutching bottles and a few raided trays of sweetmeats. The aircraft hissed into the night. Gerge, Ye, and Chambliss finished their card game. Gerge won. "Well, I have to go," Ye said, standing and stretching. "Chambliss?" "Also, I'll come with you. We can share a car." Gerge saw them to the house elevator. Ye buttoned her cloak. Chambliss turned to Gerge. "Want me to say anything to contact?" Gerge, who had been absently looking up at the stairs leading to the main house, looked puzzledly at Chambliss. So did Ye. "Oh yes," Gerge said, smiling. He shrugged. "Why not? See what our betters can come up with. What have I got to lose?" He laughed. "I love to see you happy," Ye said, kissing him lightly. She stepped into the elevator. Chambliss followed her. Ye winked at Gerge as the doors closed. "My regards to Ren," she grinned. Gerge stared at the closed door for a moment, then shook his head, smiling to himself. He went back to the lounge, where a couple of the house remote drones were tidying up. Everything seemed back in place, as it should be. He went over to the game board sat between the dark couches and adjusted one of the deploy pieces so that it sat in the center of its starting hexagon, then looked at the couch where Ye had sat after she'd come back from her run. There was a fading patch of dampness there, dark on dark. He put his hand out hesitantly, touched it, sniffed his fingers, then laughed at himself. That's a bit creepy. He took an umbrella and went out to inspect the damage done to the lawn by the aircraft. Before returning to the house, where a light in the squat main tower told that Ren was waiting for him. The elevator dropped 200 meters through the mountain, then through the bedrock underneath. It slowed to cycle through a rotate lock, and gently lowered itself through the meter of ultra-dense base material to stop underneath the orbital plate in a transit gallery, where a couple of underground cars waited, and the outside screens showed sunlight blazing up onto the plate base. Ye and Chambliss got into a car, told it where they wanted to go, and sat down as it unlocked itself, turned, and accelerated away. "Contact," Ye said to Chambliss. The floor of the small car hid the sun, and beyond the side screens stars shone sharply. The car whizzed by some of the arrays of the vital but generally indecipherably obscure equipment that hung beneath every plate. Did I hear the name of the great benign bogey being mentioned? I suggest Gerge might contact, Chambliss said. It floated to a screen. The screen detached itself, still showing the view outside, and floated up the car wall until the decimeter of space its thickness had occupied. Oh, God. Give me a second. Sorry, I just need to have a drink. But yes, I would prefer if you didn't spam emotes. Thank you. Right. The screen detached itself, still showing the view outside, and floated up the car wall until the decimeter of space its thickness had occupied in the skin of the vehicle was revealed. Where the screen had pretended to be a window was now a real window. A slab of transparent crystal with hard vacuum and the rest of the universe on the other side. Chambliss looked out at the stars. It occurred to me they might have some ideas, something to occupy him. I thought you were wary of contact. I am, generally, but I know a few of the minds, and I still have some connections. I trust them to help, I think. I don't know, Ye said. We're all taking this awful seriously. He'll come out of it. He's got friends. Nothing too terrible is going to happen to him as long as his pals are around. The drone said. The car stopped at one of the elevator tubes serving the village where Chambliss and Malkne lived. Will we see you in Trons? The drone asked. No, I have a site conference that evening, Ye said. And then there's a young fellow I saw at the shoot the other day. I've arranged to bump into him that night. She grinned. Ha, I see, Chambliss said. Lapsing into predatory mode, eh? Well, enjoy your bumping. I'll try. Ye laughed. She and the drone bade each other good night. Then Chambliss went through the car's lock, its ancient, minutely battered casing suddenly bright in the blast of sunlight from underneath, and went straight up the elevator tube without waiting for a lift. Ye smiled and shook her head at such geriatric precocity. Precocity, as the car pulled away again. Wren slept on, half covered by a sheet. Her black hair spilled across the top of the bed. Gerge sat at his occasional desk near the balcony windows, looking out at the night. The rain had passed, the clouds thinned and separated, and now the light of the stars and the 4 plates on the far balancing side of the Chiak orbital, 3 million kilometers away and with their inner faces in daylight, cast a silvery sheen on the passing clouds and made the dark fjord waters glitter. He turned on the desk pad, pressed its calibrated margin a few times until he found the relevant publications, then read for a while, papers on game theory by other respected players, reviews of some of their games, analysis of new games and promising players. He opened the windows later and stepped out onto a circular balcony, shivering a little as the cool night air touched his nakedness. He'd taken his pocket terminal with him and braved the cold for a while, talking to the dark trees and the silent fjord, dictating a a new paper on old games. When he went back in, Ren Lian was still asleep, but breathing quickly and erratically. Intrigued, he went over to her and crouched down by the side of the bed, looking intently at her face as it twitched and contorted in her sleep. Her breath laboured in her throat and down her delicate nose, and her nostrils flared. Gergely squatted like that for some minutes, with an odd expression on his face, somewhere between a sneer and a sad smile, wondering, with a sense of vague frustration, even regret, what sort of nightmares the young woman must be having to make her quiver and pant and whimper so. The next 2 days passed relatively uneventfully. He spent most of the time reading papers by other players and theorists, and finished a paper of his own which he'd started the night Ren Lian stayed. Ren had left during breakfast the next morning, after an argument. He liked to work during breakfast. She'd wanted to talk. He'd suspected she was just tetchy after not sleeping well. He caught up on some correspondence. Mostly it was in the form of requests to visit other worlds, take part in great tournaments, write papers, comment on new games, become a teacher or a lecturer or professor in various educational establishments, be a guest on any one of several GSVs, take on such and such a child prodigy. It was a long list. He turned them all down. It gave him a rather pleasant feeling. There was a communication from a GCU which claimed to have discovered a world on which there was a game based on the precise topography of individual snowflakes, a game which, for that reason, was never played on the same board twice. Gergely had never heard of such a game, and could find no mention of it in the usually up-to-date files Contact collated for people like him. He suspected the game was a fake. GCUs were notoriously mischievous, but sent a considered and germane, if not also rather ironic, reply, because the joke, if it was a joke, appealed to him. He watched a gliding competition over the mountains and cliffs on the far side of the fjord. He turned on the house holoscreen and watched a recently made entertainment he'd heard people talking about. It concerned a planet whose intelligent inhabitants were sentient glaciers and their iceberg children. I'm gonna time you out because you're kinda being kind of annoying, dude. Chill. Relax, please. Please stop spamming emotes. Thank you, Ren. I appreciate it. He had expected to despise his preposterousness, but found it quite amusing. He'd sketched out a glacier game, based on what sort of minerals could be gouged from rocks, what mountains destroyed, rivers dammed, landscapes created and bays blocked if, as in the entertainment, glaciers could liquefy and refreeze themselves at will. The game was diverting enough, but contained nothing original. He abandoned it after an hour or so. He spent much of the next day swimming in Ecro's basement pool. When doing the backstroke, he dictated as well, his pocket terminal tracking up and down the pool with him, just overhead. In the late afternoon, a woman and her young daughter came riding through the forest and stopped off at Ecro. Neither of them showed any sign of having heard of him. They just happened to be passing. He invited them to stay for a drink, and made them a late lunch. They tethered their tall, panting mounts in the shade at the side of the house, where the drones gave them water. He advised the woman on the most scenic route to take. Route. It is route, isn't it? The scenic route to take, when she and her daughter resumed their journey, and gave a child a piece from a highly ornamented Bauhaus set she'd admired. He took dinner on the terrace, the terminal screen open and showing the pages of an ancient barbarian treatise on games. The book, a millennium old when the civilization had been contacted 2,000 years earlier, was limited in its appreciation, of course, but Gerge never ceased to be fascinated by the way a society's games revealed so much about its ethos, its philosophy, its very soul. Besides, barbarian societies had always intrigued him, even before their games had. The book was interesting. He rested his eyes watching the sun going down, then went back into it as the darkness deepened. The house drones brought him drinks, a heavier jacket, a light snack, as he requested them. He told the house to refuse all incoming calls. The terrace lights gradually brightened. Chirk's far side shone whitely overhead, coating everything in silver. Stars twinkled in a cloudless sky. Gerge read on. The terminal beeped. He looked severely at the camera eyes set in one corner of the screen. "House," he said, "are you going deaf?" "Please forgive the override," a rather officious and unapologetic voice Gerge did not recognize said from the screen. "Am I talking to Chirk Gavensa Jurnau Morat Gerge Damhesso?" Gerge stared dubiously at the screen eye. He hadn't heard his full name pronounced for years. "Yes. My name is Lausch Ermasco Iop." These names are so needlessly complicated, it's really hard to read them out. "My name is Lausch Ermasco Iop Wu Handrahan Zato Kum." What? Dude, just call him Kevin. Gerge raised one eyebrow. "Well, that should be easy enough to remember." "Might I interrupt you, sir?" "You already have. What do you want?" "To talk with you. Despite my override, this does not constitute an emergency, but I can only talk to you directly this evening. I am here representing the contact section at the request of Dastaveb Chamlis Amalkne Epandra. Jesus, I'm gonna just skip some of these. May I approach you?" "Providing you can stay off the full names, yes," Gerge said. "I shall be there directly." Gerge snapped the screen shut. Oops, sorry now. He tapped the pen-like terminal on the edge of the wooden table and looked out over the dark fjord, watching the dim lights of the few houses on the far shore. He heard a roaring noise in the sky and looked up to see a far side-lit vapor trail overhead, steeply angled and pointing to the slope uphill from Ikro. There was a muffled bang over the forest above the house, and a noise like a sudden gust of wind. Then, zooming around the side of the house, came a small drone, its fields bright blue and striped yellow. It drifted over towards Gerge. The machine was about the same as Morin Skell. It could, Gerge thought, have sat comfortably in the rectangular sandwich plate on the table. Its gunmetal casing looked a little more complicated and knobbly than Morin Skell's. "Good evening," Gerge said, as the small machine cleared the terrace wall. It settled down on the table by the sandwich plate. "Good evening, Morat Gerge." "Contact, eh?" Gerge said, putting his terminal into a pocket in his robe. "That was quick. I was only talking to Chalmers the night before last." "I happened to be in the volume," the machine explained in its clipped voice, "in transit, between the GCU flexible demeanor and the GSV unfortunate conflict of evidence, aboard the DROU Zealot. As the nearest contact operative, I was the obvious choice to visit you. However, as I say, I can only stay for a short time." "Oh, what a pity," Gerge said. "Yes, you have such a charming orbital here. Perhaps some other time." "Well, I hope it hasn't been a wasted journey for you, Loesch. I wasn't really expecting an audience with a contact operative. My friend Chalmers thought contact might, I don't know, have something interesting which wasn't in general circulation." "I expected nothing at all, or just information. Might I ask just what you're doing here?" "Hello, TT." He leaned forward, putting both elbows on the table, leaning over the small machine. There was one sandwich left on the plate just in front of the drone. Gergely took it and ate, munching and looking at the machine. Certainly, I am here to ascertain just how open to suggestions you are. Contact might be able to find you something that would interest you. A game? I have been given to understand it's connected with a game. That does not mean you have to play one with me, Gergely said, brushing his hands free of crumbs over the plate. A few crumbs flew towards the drone, as he hoped they might, but it fielded each one, flicking them neatly to the centre of the plate in front of it. All I know, sir, is that Contact might have found something to interest you. I believe it to be connected with a game. I am instructed to discover how willing you might be to travel. I therefore assume the game, if such it is to be played in a location besides Chark. Travel? Gergely said. He sat back. Where? How far? How long? I don't know exactly. Well, try approximately. I would not like to guess. How long would you be prepared to spend away from home? Gergely's eyes narrowed. The longest he'd spent away from Chark had been when he'd gone on a cruise once, 30 years earlier. He hadn't enjoyed it especially. He'd gone more because it was the done thing to travel at that age than because he'd wanted to. The different stellar systems had been spectacular, but you could see just as good a view on a holoscreen, and he still didn't really understand what people saw in actually having been in any particular system. He'd planned to spend a few years on that cruise, but gave up after one. Gergely rubbed his beard. Perhaps half a year or so. It's hard to say without knowing the details. Say that, though. Say half a year. Not that I can see it's necessary. Local colour rarely adds that much to a game. Normally true. The machine paused. I understand this might be rather a complicated game. It might take a while to learn. It is likely you would have to devote yourself to it for some time. I'm sure I'll manage, Gergely said. The longest it had taken him to learn any game had been 3 days. He hadn't forgotten any rule of any game in all his life, nor ever had to learn one twice. Very well, the small drone said suddenly. On that basis I shall report back. Farewell, Morat Gergely. It started to accelerate into the sky. Gergely looked up at it, mouth open. He resisted the urge to jump up. Is that it? He said. The small machine stopped a couple of meters up. That's all I'm allowed to talk about. I've asked you what I was supposed to ask you. Now I report back. Why, is there anything else you would like to know I might be able to help you with? Yes, Gergely said, annoyed now. Do I get to hear anything else about whatever and wherever it is you're talking about? The machine seemed to waver in the air. Its feels hadn't changed since its arrival. Eventually, it said, Sure now, Gergely? There was a long moment when they were both silent. Gergely stared at the machine, then stood up, put both hands on his hips and his head to one side, and shouted, Yes! Probably not, the drone snapped, and instantly rose straight up, feels flicking off. He heard the roaring noise and saw the vapour trail form. It was a single tiny cloud at first because he was right underneath it. Then it lengthened slowly for a few seconds, before suddenly ceasing to grow. He took out the pocket terminal. House, he said. Raise that drone. He continued to stare into the sky. What drone, Journow? The house said. Chambliss? He stared at the terminal. No, that little scumbag from Contact. Lo Shamarsko Iep, etc., etc., etc. That's who. The one that was just here. Just here? The house said in his puzzled voice. Gergely sagged. He sat down. You didn't see or hear anything just now? Nothing but silence for the last 11 minutes, Gergely, since you told me to hold all calls. There have been 2 of those, but never mind, Gergely sighed. Get me Hub. Hub here, McKillstrabe mine subsection. Now, Gerge, what can we do for you? Gerge was still looking at the sky overhead, partly because that was where the contact drone had gone. The thin vapor trail was starting to expand and drift, and partly because people tended to look in the direction of the hub when they were talking to it. He noticed the extra star just before it started to move. The light point was near the trailing end of the little drone's far side-lit contrail. He frowned. Almost immediately it moved, only moderately fast at first, then too quickly for the eye to anticipate. It disappeared. He was silent for a moment, then said, Hub? Has a contact ship just left here? Doing so even as we speak, Gerge, the demilitarized rapid offense unit, Zealot. Gerge finished. Ho ho, it was you, was it? We thought it was going to take months to work that one out. You've just seen a private visit, game player Gerge. Contact business, not for us to know. Wow, were we inquisitive though. Very glamorous now, if we may say so. That ship crash-stopped from at least 40 kilolights and swerved 20 years. Just for a 5-minute chat with you, it would seem. That is serious energy usage, especially as it's accelerating away just as fast. Look at that kid go. Oh, sorry. You can't. Well, take it from us. We're impressed. Care to tell a humble hub mind subsection what it was all about? Any chance of contacting the ship? Gerge said, ignoring the question. Dragging away like that, business end pointed straight back at a mere civilian machine like ourselves. The hub mind sounded amused. Yeah, we suppose so. I want a drone on it, called Lo Shamasco app, blah 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 blah. Oh my god. There's so many names. There's so many names and titles in these names. Holy shit, Gerge. What are you tangling with here? Handrahan? Zato? That's a Quiv Tech espionage level SC nomenclature. Nomenclature? I don't know how to pronounce this, I'm sorry. Heavy messing. Shit, we'll try. Just a moment. Gerge waited in silence for a few seconds. Nothing, the view said. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Nomenclature, thank you. Nothing, the voice from the terminal said. Gerge, this is Hub Entire speaking here, not a subsection, all of me. That ship's acknowledging, but it's claiming there is no drone of that name or anything like it aboard. Gerge slumped back in the seat. His neck was stiff. He looked down from the stars, down at the table. You don't say, he said. Shall I try again? Think it'll do any good? No. Then don't. Gerge, this disturbs me. What is going on? I wish, Gerge said. I knew. He looked up at the stars again. The little drone's ghostly vapor trail had almost disappeared. Get me Chambliss Amalkane, will you? Online. Journal? What hub? Be careful. Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. You must have annoyed it, Chambliss said through the terminal. Very likely, Gerge said. But what do you think? By the way, I'm gonna be ending in about like 10 minutes or so. If the chapter doesn't come sooner, because I'm not used to reading for this long aloud at all, so my throat's starting to get a little bit sore, if that's okay. Very likely, Gerge said, but what do you think? They were sizing you up for something. You think so? Yes, but you just refused the deal. Did I? Yes, and you think yourself lucky you did too. What do you mean? This was your idea. Look, you're out of it. It's over, but obviously my request went further and quicker than I thought it would. We triggered something, but you've put them off. They aren't interested anymore. I suppose you're right. Gerge, I'm sorry. Never mind, Gergay told the old machine. He looked up at the stars. Hub? Hey, we're interested. If it had been purely personal, we wouldn't have listened to a word, we swear, and besides, it would be notified on your daily communication statement we were listening. Never mind all that, Gergay smiled, oddly relieved the orbital's mind had been eavesdropping. Just tell me how far away that ROU is. On the word is, it was 1 minute and 49 seconds away, a light month distant, already clear of the system and well out of our jurisdiction, we're very glad to say, hightailing it in the direction a little upspin of a galactic core. Looks like it's heading for the GSV unfortunate conflict of evidence, unless one of them's trying to fool somebody. Thank you, Hub. Good night. To you too. And you're on your own this time, we promise. Thank you, Hub. Chambliss? You might have missed the chance of a lifetime, Gergay, but it was more likely a narrow escape. I'm sorry for suggesting contact. They came too fast and too hard to be usual. Don't worry so much, Chambliss, he told the drone. He looked back at the stars again and sat back, swinging his foot up onto the table. I handled it. We managed. Will I see you at Tron's tomorrow? Maybe. I don't know. I'll think about it. Good luck. I mean, against this wonder child at Stricken, if I don't see you tomorrow. He grinned ruefully into the darkness. Thanks. Good night, Chambliss. Good night, Gergay. The train emerged from the tunnel into bright sunlight. It banked round the remainder of the curve, then set out across the slender bridge. Gergay looked over the handrail and saw the lush green pastures and brightly winding river 1/2 kilometre below on the valley floor. Shadows of mountains lay across the narrow meadows. Shadows of clouds freckled the tree-covered hills themselves. The wind of the train's slipstream ruffled his hair as he drank in the sweet, scented mountain air and waited for his opponent to return. Birds circled in the distance over the valley, almost level with the bridge. Their cries sounded through the still air, just audible over the wind-rush sound of the train's passing. Normally he'd have waited until he was due in Trons that evening and go there underground, but that morning he'd felt like getting away from Ikro. He'd put on boots, a pair of conservatively styled pants, and a short, open jacket, then taken to the hill paths, hiking over the mountain and down the other side. He'd sat by the side of the old railway line, glanding a mild buzz and amusing himself by chucking little bits of lodestone onto the track's magnetic field and watching them bounce out again. He'd thought about Ye's floating islands. He'd also thought about the mysterious visitation from the contact drone on the previous evening, but somehow that would just not come clear. It was as though it had been a dream. He had checked the house communication and system statement. As far as the house was concerned, there had been no visit, but his conversation with Jacob was logged, timed and witnessed by other subsections of the hub, and by the hub entire for a short while, so it had happened all right. He'd flagged down the antique train when it appeared, and even as he climbed on, he had been recognized by a middle-aged man called Dreltrim, who was also making his way to Trons. Mr. Dreltrim would treasure a defeat at the hands of the great Jernau Gunge more than victory over anybody else. Would he play? Gergay was well used to such flattery. It usually masked an unrealistic but slightly feral ambition, but had suggested they play possession. It shared enough rule concepts with Stricken to make it a decent limbering up exercise. They'd found a possession set in one of the bars and taken it out onto the roof deck, sitting behind a windbreak so that the cards wouldn't blow away. They ought to have enough time to complete the game. The train would take most of the day to get to Trons, a journey an underground car could accomplish in 10 minutes. The train left the bridge and entered a deep, narrow ravine, its slipstream producing an eerie, echoing noise off the naked rocks on either side. Gergay looked at the game board. He was playing straight, without the help of any glanded substances. His opponent was using a potent mixture suggested by Gergely himself. In addition, Gergely had given Mr. Dreltrim a 7-piece lead at the start, which was the maximum allowed. The fellow wasn't a bad player, and had come close to overwhelming Gergely at the start, when his advantage in pieces had the greatest effect, but Gergely had defended well, and the man's chance had probably gone, though there was still the possibility he might have a few mines left in awkward places. Thinking of such unpleasant surprises, Gergely realized he hadn't looked at where his own hidden piece was. This had been another unofficial way of making the game more even. Possession is played on a 40-square grid. The 2 players' pieces are distributed in 1 major group and 2 minor groups each. Up to 3 pieces can be hidden on differently initially unoccupied intersections. Sorry, just 1 second. Oh, sorry about that. Up to 3 pieces can be hidden on different initially unoccupied intersections. Their locations are dialed and locked into 3 circular cards, thin ceramic wafers which are turned over only when the player wishes to bring those pieces into play. Mr. Dreltrim had already revealed all 3 of his hidden pieces. One had happened to be on the intersection Gergely had, sportingly, sewn all 9 of his mines on, which really was bad luck. Gergely had spun the dials on his single hidden piece wafer and put it face down on the table without looking at it. He had no more idea where that piece was than Mr. Dreltrim. It might turn out to be an illegal position, which could well lose him the game, or, less likely, it might turn up in a strategically useful place deep inside his opponent's territory. Gergely liked playing this way, if it wasn't a serious game. As well as giving his opponent a probably needed extra advantage, it made the match as a whole more interesting and less predictable, added as extra spice to the proceedings. He supposed he ought to find out where the piece was. The 80 move point was fast approaching when the piece had to be revealed anyway. He couldn't see his hidden piece wafer. He looked over the piece. Did I say peef? I said peef. He couldn't see his hidden piece wafer. He looked over the card and wafer-strewn table. Mr. Dreltrim was not... Sorry, pardon me. Pea wafer. I'm sorry. He looked over the card and wafer-strewn table. Mr. Dreltrim was not the most tidy of players. His cards and wafers and unused or removed pieces were scattered over most of the table, including the parts supposed to be Gergely's. A gust of wind when they'd entered the tunnel an hour ago had almost blown some of the lighter cards away, and they'd weighed them down with goblets and lead glass paperweights. These added to the impression of confusion, as did Mr. Dreltrim's quaint, if rather affected, custom of noting down all the moves by hand on a scratch tablet. He claimed the built-in memory on a board had broken down on him once, and lost him all record of one of the best games he'd ever played. Gergely started lifting bits and pieces up, humming to himself, and looking for the flat wafer. He heard a sudden intake of breath, then what sounded like a rather embarrassed cough. Oh, just behind him. He turned around to see Mr. Dreltrim behind him, looking oddly awkward. Gergely frowned as Mr. Dreltrim just returned from the bathroom, his eyes wide with a mixture of drugs he was glanding, and followed by a tray bearing drinks, sat down again, staring at Gergely's hands. It was only then, as the tray set the glasses on the table, that Gergely realized the cards he happened to be holding which he had lifted up to look for his hidden piece wafer, were Mr. Dreltram's remaining mine cards. Gergay looked at them. They were still face down. Oh, he hadn't seen where the mines were, and understood what Mr. Dreltram must be thinking. He put the cards back where he'd found them. "I'm very sorry," he laughed. "I was looking for my hidden piece." He saw it even as he spoke the words. The circular wafer was lying, uncovered, almost right in front of him on the table. "Ah," he said, and only then he felt the blood rise to his face. "Here it is. Couldn't see it for looking at it." He laughed again, and as he did so, felt a strange clutching sensation coursing through him, seeming to squeeze his guts in something between terror and ecstasy. He had never experienced anything like it. The closest any sensation had ever come, he thought, suddenly, clearly, had been when he was still a boy and he'd experienced his first orgasm at the hands of a girl a few years older than him. Crude, purely human, basic, like a single instrument picking out a simple theme a note at a time, compared to the drug-gland-boosted symphonies sex would later become. The first time had nevertheless been one of his most memorable experiences, not just because it was then novel, but because it seemed to open up a whole new fascinating world, an entirely different type of sensation and being. It had been the same when he'd played his first competition game as a child, representing Chiark against another Orbital's junior team, and it would be the same again when his drug glands matured a few years after puberty. Mr. Dreltram laughed too, and wiped his face with a handkerchief. Gergay played furiously for the next few moves, and had to be reminded by his opponent when the 80-move deadline came up. Gergay turned over his hidden piece without having checked it first, risking it occupying the same square as one of his revealed pieces. The hidden piece, on a 1600 to 1 chance, turned up in the same position as the heart, the piece the whole game was about, the piece one's opponent was trying to take possession of. Gergay sat at the intersection where his well-defended heart piece sat, then again at the coordinates he'd dialed at random onto the wafer 2 hours earlier. They were the same, there was no doubt. If he'd looked a move earlier, he could have moved the heart out of danger, but he hadn't. He'd lost both pieces, and with the heart lost, the game was lost. He'd lost. Gergay, Oh, bad luck, Mr. Dreltram said, clearing his throat. Gergay nodded. "I believe it's customary at such moments of disaster for the defeated player to be given the heart as a keepsake," he said, fingering the lost piece. So I understand," Mr. Dreltram said, obviously at once embarrassed on Gergay's behalf, and delighted at his own good fortune. Gergay nodded. He put the heart down, lifted the ceramic wafer which had betrayed him. "I'd rather have this, I think." He held it up to Mr. Dreltram, who nodded. "Well, of course. I mean, why not? I certainly wouldn't object." The train rolled quietly into a tunnel, slowing for a station set in the caverns beneath the mountainside. Right. Okay, that's all I'm gonna do for today, if that's okay. I didn't realize how long these chapters were. Oh my god. Oh, I'm just gonna stretch. I'm sorry. It's kind of interesting to read though for that long. Yeah. So that was a little bit, anyway, of a book called The Player of Games by Ian M. Banks. But I am considering making a weekly thing. It is a really good book, though a slow starter. And I hope you guys have a good night, or a good evening, or a good day, or a good morning, or whatever part you guys are on. And thank you very much for coming and listening. Thank you. Bye bye.